Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for to our present and future audience online. It's good to see some familiar friends here, familiar faces here. This talk is going to be in English, but I think we can stop and translate any questions you may have. My name is Humberto Moro, and I'm Deputy Director and Senior Curator at the Tamayo Museum here in Mexico City. And I'm here today with Jenny Moore, who is Director at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas. And today we're going to speak a little bit about her work in the Chinati Foundation, and we're going to present the book, the Chinati Foundation, the Vision of Donald Judd.
Now, so this is the only one that's in the world. The rest are in a shipping container, but you can order them. They will be available to purchase soon.
I'm thrilled to have Jenny here today, not only because we share a last name, but because we also just found out that we went to the same master's program, and we had a lot of things to talk about. Most of it was gossip. But yeah,
that's for the question answer session. If anyone wants to know how Bard Center for Curatorial Studies was as young students, we can share that information.
So I'm going to introduce Jenny a little bit. She's the director of the Chinati Foundation, a contemporary art museum founded by the artist Donald Judd in Marfa, Texas, situated in a former military base and comprised of 34 buildings and 340 acres set in the high desert grasslands of far west Texas. Chinati is one of the most unique and important installations of contemporary art in the world, and she was appointed in 2013, almost 7 years ago, and she oversaw the capital campaign, construction, and completion of Robert Irwin Untitled Dawn to Dusk in 2016, and a 10,000 square foot installation that is the largest and only permanent structure devoted exclusively to Irwin's singular shaping of light, space, and perception. Under her leadership, Chinati completed and published the first comprehensive master plan for the museum that we're going to see a little bit later. Supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Chinati's two-part 15-year master plan describes the museum history, surveys its present, and establishes both practical and philosophical guidelines for its future. A capital campaign to support the master plan was launched in 2019, and in the 6 years of Moore's tenure as director, Chinati has experienced a 30% increase in visitorship annually, and in 2019, Chinati welcomed over 49,000 visitors. Moore has also over 20 years of experience in the field of contemporary art. Prior to her appointment at Chinati, she was associate curator at the New Museum in New York City, where she curated Pictures from the Moon, artist holograms from 1969 to 2019 in 2012, and saw the presentation of the works by Charles Atlas, Ellen Alfest, Erika Vogt, Stania Khan, and Brian Brass. She also co-organized Rosemary Turkel at Cosmos in 2012, New York City 1993, Experimental Jet Set, Trash, and No Star in 2013, and Chris Burden, Extreme Measures in 2013, which was a great exhibition. From 2005 to 10, Moore was project curator for the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and in addition, she was assistant curator and exhibition coordinator for 10,000 Lives, the 8-1 Biennial, working with artistic director Massimiliano Gioni. Moore received an MA from the Center for Curatorial Studies in Bard College and a BA cum laude in cultural anthropology from Wake Forest University in North Carolina. Thank you, Jenny, for joining us. This is an impressive past, and just thinking about your past, I want to start this conversation by you telling us a little bit of your personal experience and how was it that you were interested in the arts and you saw that as a career for you. What was the conditions and the moment that you realized that you wanted to be an cultural agent?
I thank you for being here. Thanks for staying with us. I know we're running late, but maybe we'll talk fast and try and catch up time. But I think like many curators, because I started as a curator, I didn't think I was going to actually be a museum director. But many curators start off as artists. And then for me personally, I realized that I was never going to be a very good artist. When I was out of school and didn't have an assignment to make work, I didn't have the stamina to be alone in the studio. It's such an intense process that I just couldn't do. But I wanted to be with artists, and if I couldn't be a great artist, I wanted to help great artists do great things. So I found myself on the other side of the coin. And I was in New York early on, where I think it was we were talking about this earlier. I started my career, the sort of last gasp of alternative spaces in New York City. Those of us that spend time in New York right now, it's incredibly expensive and it's becoming very conventional. But I was very lucky that early on in my career, I met young artists. You could still be a very poor but very happy young artist in New York. And I found myself working for a really interesting institution called Exit Art, which doesn't exist anymore, but some people might know that. And in fact, I just saw Miguel Calderon, who I met from those days. Could tell some stories, I won't. But anyway, it wasn't until I went to graduate school that I came with a very alternative background, different kinds of artists, not blue chip artists at all. But I had a revelation of the way our program was structured. You have curatorial professionals who come and teach for a semester. And I was very lucky that Dia Beacon, if anyone has been to Dia Beacon had just opened, and the curator Lynn Cook and the director Michael Govan taught a class for my graduate program. And I was the I was the alternative art girl. I wasn't into the blue chip artists. I think most of us, when we go into the minimalism room in most museums, it's white-walled, hermetically sealed, evenly lit. One example, maybe made in 1968, maybe it has a square. It did not feel very interesting to me. I knew that work was important, but it didn't speak to me from what my personal background was, until I went to Dia Beacon and had a revelation that this is an image of Donald Judd's installation at Chinati. This is what he wanted you to know about his work. And it opened my eyes to what artists can do if institutions give them the support. By the time Judd came to Marfa, has anybody been to Chinati? Yes, thank you. You made the journey. It's not on the way to anywhere, so you have to just go there. Marfa is a town of now 1,700 people. It's 3 hours from the closest airport. El Paso is 3 hours away, and Midland Odessa is 3 hours away. We're 60 miles from the border. Judd left New York looking for this, and here he could find space and make an institution that supported his work in the way he thought it needed to be seen, not in a conventional museum situation. So should I go through a few things? So that's Marfa, Texas in 1930. That's Marfa now. It hasn't changed very much. This is Donald Judd in the 1970s. He left New York kind of at the height of his career and moved to far west Texas. He started as a painter. I don't know if people know this about Judd, but he was frustrated by, you can't make space in a painting. You can't make real space in a painting. You can represent space, but you can't make real space. So he started carving into the surface of his paintings, and then he put a baking pan into the surface of his paintings to try and make space, and then he finally made space with sculpture. And of course, these are the very iconic Donald Judd called boxes. We like to call them sculptures, or as he called them, specific objects. He first started these ideas at 101 Spring Street in New York City. His ideas of art and architecture and life and living, that there should be no separation between art and life. That convention is just a false dichotomy, that you can live with art, you can surround yourself with art. It doesn't have to be a trip to a museum on Sunday afternoon and is not a part of your fundamental lived experience. So he went to Marfa looking for space. He thought that institutions were not taking into consideration not just the time and care that artists put into making the work, but also, in Judd's case and many other artists, the time and care and consideration that goes into the experience of the work. By this time, he was successful. His work was being shipped around the world. It was coming back damaged. The time and care that he went into what he wanted his work to be experienced was very short. The cycle of exhibitions was just rapid and unending, and he thought none of that was how he wanted you to be able to experience his work. He first installed what were private live-in workspaces. This is a studio space that's now open to the public under the auspices of Judd Foundation. This is another space. And while he was installing private spaces with the financial support of DIA Art Foundation, he bought this, which is Fort D.A. Russell. This is a former military base. The first buildings were built 1918. It served through 2 world wars. I've learned this was the site of the first American international invasion when we went into Mexico to find Pancho Villa. That started from this military base. This is what it looks like today. He could work on a scale that wasn't possible anywhere else. This is a sculpture that is 1 kilometer in length. I'll move through this quickly so we can actually have a conversation. But I think it's important for people to know who haven't been what the scope and scale of Judd's vision here was. It's important to consider here he could work in architecture in ways that he couldn't before. These were former artillery sheds. That's what they looked like with just rolled down garage doors where the military housed mechanized vehicles and the artillery. Judd transformed these buildings architecturally to make them suitable for the art that he permanently installed in them. 100 works in mill aluminum. So here Judd could work his ideas of this relationship between art, architecture, and the land in a way that wasn't possible anywhere else. And you can see the concrete pieces in the background and these buildings that house 100 works in mill aluminum. From the beginning, Judd wanted to support other artists. I think that's a revelation for people. Judd, Chinati, and Marfa often gets conflated into one thing, this magical thing happening somewhere in Texas. But Judd, of course, is an artist, and Marfa is a city, and Chinati is an institution. And from the beginning, he wanted this museum to support other artists, not just his own work. So he turned a former wool and mohair warehouse into a permanent installation of John Chamberlain's work. This is the largest installation of John Chamberlain's work in the world. The former barracks buildings he gave to Dan Flavin, who chose 6 buildings and installed the largest permanent installation of his colored fluorescent light works across the museum spaces. He invited his friends to come. They were so inspired they made work. So this is Klaus Oldenburg and Kuja von Brugen's Monument to the Last Horse. That's Judd on the left and Klaus on the right. This is what it looks like now. Ilya Kabakov, School Number 6, an abandoned Russian schoolhouse. Ronnie Horn. Judd met Ronnie when Ronnie was very young, purchased these pieces together. They chose a former mess hall. John Wesley. So it just shows the expanse of what Chinati is. From the beginning, our mission has been preserve and present. I think people hear the word preserve and they think that it's fixed in time. But actually, we continue to add to the collection. This was the hospital for Fort D.A. Russell. We transformed that into the Robert Irwin permanent installation. It's a building divided in dark on one side, light on the other. So we continue to work with artists and add to the collection following the spirit of Judd. This was a former ice house that was turned into a camera obscura by the artist Zoe Leonard. We've now installed massive floor pieces by Judd that we found in a stable that was covered in plastic and stored for 30 years. That was a really exciting thing to find behind a door. We also have partnerships. From the beginning, Judd invited his friends to come and live and work in Marfa. We continue that tradition with artist residencies and public performances. This is Solange. She came and performed at Sunset across Judd's 15 works in concrete. And this is an installation by Bridget Riley, who, this was a revelation for her in her 80s. This was a new way of working for her. This was a wall painting that covered the entire barracks building. And this is the museum, 34 buildings and 340 acres. So how we got talking was, how do you you can't put this in a box, but hopefully you can put it in a book so that people understand what it is, how important it is for these artists, how important it is still for us, and I think in the world, and in your curatorial work the same, to follow where the artists lead, to let them take charge. It's their vision that brings us to places maybe we couldn't get to on our own culturally, but certainly in this place geographically. You know, artists take us to incredible places, and Chinati is one of those really incredible places in the world.
Now, you have been the director of this project, and you have led the efforts for almost 7 years. You started there as an intern, which is, I think, a fascinating story, because I really believe in sort of like repetition and sort of like revisiting places and institutions. So tell us a tiny bit about your own history with the site.
So when I was in graduate school, as you remember, we have a requirement for an internship, and I had a revelation of these artists' work when I was privileged to take a class with Lynn Cook and Michael Govan when Dia Beacon opened. And again, I didn't think this was work that I was connecting to, but I did. And Lynn Cook very significantly encouraged me to come here. If you believe in these artists, if you believe in this, you have to go and see it. And you all know that it's a revelation for what Judd's work is in the world. And so my internship was here, working under the first director, Mariana Stockelbrand. You're given an apartment on the grounds, so you live at the museum with the work. Full disclosure, the tequila flows like water in Marfa, Texas, so it was a really terrific place to have an internship.
We're no strangers to that.
Yeah, I know. Well, we started with a frozen margarita. And I think the chance to live in a museum as a young person and be given the authority that, you know, you give the tours, you have the keys to the collection, you live with the work, was a really important experience. I tell every young person I meet to take their internship seriously, because someday you can come back as director. So that experience was incredibly formative for me for the work I went back to do in New York, working with Massimiliano Gioni, and at the new museum. And then I got a call one day that Chinati was looking for a new director, and a couple people had put my name forth. So I knew what I was getting into to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. But being responsible for a museum that's 34 buildings and 340 acres, historic buildings, transformed by the artist, the number of meetings we have about leaking buildings and cutting the grass, and when the pronghorn antelope come and are rubbing against the concrete sculptures, things you just would not imagine are part of museum directors, besides the fundraising and being a good team with the staff. This is so unconventional in so many ways, but I think people make that journey looking for a meaningful experience with art, and they find it here, and that's to the visitor numbers. Increasing visitorship has not been a priority for me as a director, but welcoming all of the people that make that journey has been a priority. So how can we make sure that going from 12,000 people to 50,000 people still feels like a singular experience for any of you who make that journey, and that you have the freedom to be with that art in a way that's not compromised by so many people and too much information, and it's a constant juggle.
Now, what would you say has changed over these almost 7 years? When you started this position, I guess that you had very specific challenges, and I want to know if those are still pretty much the same challenges, or if you have faced new situations, how the process of being a director of this institution has changed you or the institution.
I think I was compelled to start with the word success, because when you can endure and you can continue to uphold the mission, and here it's to preserve and present, and you have that many more people wanting to come have an experience with the art, that's success. But I remember this from Sheena Wagstaff. I was in a audience like this, and she was up on a stage like this, and she was asked about the success of the Tate Modern. And she revealed that they were so successful the first year. They had anticipated 1 million people would come and visit the Tate. They had 4 million people. I think I'm getting these numbers right. The first year, they needed to find a toilet paper sponsor because they couldn't afford the toilet paper bill. That's such a crazy idea of that kind of success. And so I think where institutions spend so much time worrying about not failing, do they take as much time trying to figure out how to manage success? So for us, that was a master plan. What we have, what it needs from the ground up and history forward. And even something like in a historic site, we just need more bathrooms. With 50,000 people, anything that distracts from the experience of the art is a problem.
Right.
From the parking lot to a line to a bathroom to more water fountains, those are the kinds of things, besides always working in service to the art and the artist, those were the things that have changed. That many more people are coming to this tiny town in far west Texas, where it's a bit of a joke, but you can find a Donald Judd sculpture behind any door in this town, but you can't find a sandwich because it's not a conventional place.
Right. Now we welcome our new audience, and speaking about audiences, I want you to talk about your audience, because we were talking a little bit about this earlier, about how you have a very specific group of sort of like cultural tourism, or people that are, you know, like going specifically to experience the institution, whereas there's also a local community. So I want you to speak about what sort of like strategies or opportunities or activities you implement for those spheres that you have as visitors.
So from the beginning, I'm going to go back to just an image. From the beginning, Judd believed in responsibility to the community. So Chinati Foundation established very early on a partnership with the schools. We were the only providers of arts education in town. When Judd came to Marfa, the town was in serious economic decline. So there were buildings, a lot of buildings available for sale, but he became one of the largest employers, and he paid well. Now it's the Border Patrol. I don't know if the Border Patrol pays well, but they're the largest employer in our town. And so he recognized that through education and being a good neighbor, then that was your responsibility. 30 years later, we have a very different role to play, because the world is coming through Marfa. It has become very popular for people to buy second or third or fourth homes here. The real estate has gotten incredibly expensive. Our enrollment in school is going down. 78% of the children in our school are at or below the poverty level. So you have people, a very sophisticated public coming from all over the world here, and yet we have real issues locally. And so while Chinati and Judd were the agent of change, in the beginning that was so welcome because the town was in such serious economic decline. But now we are responsible for gentrification. People can't afford their property taxes. Our teachers can't afford to live here. Now, many cities go through this. In an urban context, it's a pretty extreme situation in a town that's this small and this far removed from other services. We actually classify as frontier, not rural. That's one step out from rural, and they classify you economically as frontier because of the way they calculate your distance to like a core mass of services. So as extreme and incredible as the art is, the challenges there are just as extreme. So how can we be a good employer? While we believe that we give back to the community economically just through the tourist industry, how can we continue to support the school? How can we make sure that the kids that are growing up in Marfa have access to the incredible people that are coming through there from all over the world. So 5-year-olds come through the school and learn about positive and negative space by standing in this room, all the way through high school. And when they hit high school, we employ them. We're flexible employers, and we explain, you're the voice of authority. You've been coming to these spaces and seeing these artists since you were 5 years old. So be a docent, give a tour, feel confident that you can talk about this work in a really sophisticated way to a very sophisticated audience, and that maybe then you could find a profession out in the world, in the art world, in a way that I think maybe is a new way of thinking for a lot of these kids what their choices are in their life.
Now, before we dive into the book formally and thinking about the social sphere, I was curious if you could speak about the importance of working in the periphery, because you obviously come from New York, from perhaps one of the most sophisticated crowds in the world, from a very solid institution as the New Museum, who has a groundbreaking history of exhibition making. And then when you move to a place that's smaller, which I also share because I did for a couple of years, there's something that shifts not only in you, but in the way that people see your practice, and things change dramatically. So I want you to speak about your own experience of doing work within the periphery of the United States, within the border, specifically also in these very complex political times in which the periphery poses enormous political challenges.
Well, when we were talking earlier, you said something great. When people ask you, well, you said it.
I remember, because whenever I went back to New York and I told them that I moved to Georgia, everyone did the same sound. They were like, oh.
Yeah.
And it
like,
was
why would you do that?
It was a very specific sound, and it was equally present everywhere. So it's kind of like a little bit condescending, but also a little bit naive of the power of working in the periphery, and like how important and relevant that is now. Because at the end of the day, New York or Paris or London, maybe they have enough exhibitions. No one's rooting for another exhibition. In that sense, I think there's a very particular intelligence that you have to work in the periphery. So I'm just curious to hear it from you, especially spending so much time, in a place that's so far away from anything, and doing such important work too.
So I think it's always great if we can have an artist's voice in a conversation, and I always remember Robert Irwin talking about the fact that when he abandoned a traditional studio practice in Los Angeles, he got in his car and he just started driving into the desert. And on one of those trips, he just kept driving south and then around. Eventually, he actually, and he tells me this is true, landed in Marfa to get a tank of gas and a Coca-Cola. And if any of you know Robert Irwin's work, there's a really great book called Seeing is Forgetting the Name of the Thing One Sees. And there's a whole chapter devoted to Robert Irwin's obsession with Coca-Cola. So he stopped to get a Coca-Cola, and there was Donald Judd. And they had known each other from New York. And Robert Irwin asked Judd what he was doing there, and Judd said, well, I'm starting to install some art. And Bob kind of doffed his cap, and they shook hands, and they went on his way, and he drove the entire periphery of the United States from that trip. And he always said the most interesting things happen on the edge, and that's where so few people spend time. And not to get too political about it, but after the last election, it made me realize we have a lot of work to do paying attention to whatever the edge means, whether that's geographically, whether that's politically. Here, we are 60 miles from the border, and I think when people come, beside it being a revelation of what the work is, it's a revelation of how codependent we are with our neighbors on the border. There is no crisis on this border in the way it's being discussed in the United States. And out here, I think for me, what was so much of a revelation was you really have to get along with everybody in a small town at the edge of the frontier, because the person, the neighbor that you might not like so much, that's the person that when you're driving through the pass and there's no cell phone reception and your car goes out or you get a flat tire, that's going to be the person who comes along that you need to rely on to just help you be safe. So there's a sense of both self-reliance out here, resilience, humor, and you've all got to get along out there, whether you really, whether you agree with the same things or not. And this is so...
There's no much of a choice.
There's no choice. You can be isolated out there, but you're not going to exist very well out there. So I think that's one of the things when I'm asked, why are so many people coming to Marfa, Texas? Why have your visitor numbers gone up by 30% annually, so it's exponential now? I think people are looking for a meaningful experience. I think people are looking, all of you are here for a meaningful experience with art. You're here to see what's, not us, but what's on the other side of these walls. And I think that as much as we travel these days, and as far as we go, and some of our great cities start to feel familiar from what, you can get a Starbucks in any great city. There's like a Gucci in every great city. Marfa isn't like anything else. So it feels so inspiring that there still are, and there's so many places like this that really are unique, amazing places that have a sense of potential that some of our great cities, it's just getting really hard these days. So I think here what's been interesting is you can find a place that has potential. You can find a place that will support ideas on this scale. And lo and behold, it becomes even more relevant and resonant 30 years later than when this artist established it. So I think there's something about the power of doing something unconventional and finding potential in places that are literally off the beaten path and finding your own way. And to keep repeating the phrase, because there are more people in the audience here, I think artists take us to places we can't get to on our own, in our minds and culturally, and they can also take you to places geographically that you wouldn't get to on your own. And I think for us, the responsibility, I was struck by, we had a very sophisticated funder come to our community day, which is when we celebrate the local talent, the kids in the schools, and we exhibit their work with as much respect and care and attention as we do Donald Judd's work. We do a big celebration, and the Ballet Folklorico comes and dances. It's like there's food and mariachi bands. And this person said, this work is so sophisticated, it must be so hard for these kids to understand. And our director of education said, not at all. This is the first art they know. So they don't come to it with all of the hang-ups that we have about art history, and it had to go from religion to representation to abstract to minimal to conceptual. They just see this as light and space and their local museum, and they have such an easier way of opening their minds to it than so many of us do by the time we get to stand in this room and try and figure out what it means.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you. And just diving formally into the book, for a place that is so phenomenological and it's all about experience, it's absolutely different to represent a temporary exhibition or a fair or a gallery show, rather than a place that it's all about experience. So the challenge of representing a place that it's supposed to be, it is about your experience there, into a book. For me, that's an overwhelming question, just to think about it. Please tell us about this process.
Well, I think we realized that while we hope everyone can make the journey to Marfa, not everyone can and not everyone will, but it's important enough to know that maybe it's important enough even to know that a place like this exists, that somewhere an artist went and changed the rules of the game and made an institution that supports these artists on their terms permanently, and that it doesn't mean that people have to do something just like this, but those ideas are so powerful. And so we we've been asked a lot, like, do you want to do a Chinati pop-up, or do you want to do these are permanently installed artworks, so they don't even get lent. These will never move from where Judd or any of the other artists in the collection, Chamberlain, Flavin, they are permanently situated because the artist could control the whole context. And Judd was very specific about saying this is the ideal experience of his work. So to try and show images of it that are photographs but don't replicate the experience, because you can't replicate what it feels like to stand in this room, in 5 minutes' time, if you're standing in this room, you're going to have a dramatically different experience because the light has changed. Your body has become sensitized to the heat. None of our spaces are climate controlled, so and it's a high desert environment. So in the summer, it's very hot in these buildings, and in the winter, it's very cold. And you can't put that in a book. But what you can put in a book are images and rigorous scholarship, and very importantly, the artist's words. Donald Judd wrote very specifically and in mass through his ideas. So to make sure that we, again, are responsible to the artist, let them say what it means to them in their words, or if the artist isn't a person who writes a lot, to make sure they understand and are comfortable and agree with the images, what the choices are for the design of the book. And for us, it was important that this be out in the world, so people had that whole compilation of knowledge and image. But then I think what's so important for us, as this is a second edition, is to show that this institution, despite its permanence, lives forward in time. So to continue to support the artists that have come after, the artists that came after Judd, the artists that came after, this first edition, and artists like Solange, or Benjamin Millepied and LA Dance Project, or Zoe Leonard, so that they become part of our history. And these are living, breathing artists who are so deeply inspired by what another artist made possible. And it's not that in Judd's idea of permanence, it was so fixed that there couldn't be other artists who enter into that conversation and bring the ideas of this experience forward into time. And since you can't put it in a box and you can't put it in a art fair, you can put it in a book and hope that even if you never make the trip to Marfa, this is enough to maybe be a life-altering experience for you. That's a lot to ask for a book, but
Right. Can you repeat a little bit what we were talking earlier about the editorial choices that you had to make in terms of images and what was actually represented within images to portray the plays accurately? Because I'm curious about your editorial process in terms of the actual object as a book.
Right. I think any of us that have done books, either with artists or of exhibitions and spaces, the images are so important. So you have to have a really great partnership with a photographer. And photographers are in many cases artists in their own right. The photographers that we worked with in the first edition, Florian Holzer, and then in the second edition with additional images by Alex Marks, for them to have that balance of their eye and their artistic approach with respecting the artist's work that they're representing, that's such a delicate balance of respect and aesthetics and ego or egoless. So we're so fortunate that in the spirit of what Chinati is and really supporting artists, I think you feel it in the book. And we were talking about this earlier. It might seem like a silly thing, but we live out in the Chihuahuan Desert, the high desert. And the first cover, and there's an image in here, let me see. The first cover showed the desert in the winter, and I can't tell you how many people said, does nothing ever live and grow in the desert? So when we did the second edition, and you can feel it was so important that yes, look, things do grow in the desert. When the rains come, you have this tremendous season where the whole desert springs to life, and you can see in these buildings how much that impacts your experience of it. The light and the land for Judd were an inseparable part of the art. So on any given day, from the clouds to the sun to the blue sky to the grass, even kind of maybe seemingly silly things have a very powerful effect. And so a person that is a regular visitor to Chinati, who drives 4 hours twice a year to come to the museum, was so excited that there would be a picture with green in it, because she said, there's so much alive here. You need to be able to tell that story. So just with 5 images that show green grass, it changes. Like that has a very different, it's funny how an image, what is it? An image can tell it that, an image can speak 1,000 words, but those are the kinds of things that we were sensitive to in continuing to tell the story of what Chinati is and how, again, it lives forward in time.
Now, and I guess before we open it to the public and in sake of time.
It feels like the visitor numbers at Chinati, it's like quadrupled since we started speaking. We have like a full audience. Maybe that's the dynamic that great art brings.
You have done such an amazing job after almost 7 years in this institution, and I think every museum director should look at what you have done with the Chinati Foundation. And I want you to talk about what your future plans are. I know you have some of that.
So Judd, and it's in this book, Judd wrote a statement for Chinati, why he wanted to make it, why it was significant. I used the word ideal, that's his word, that somewhere a portion of contemporary art had to exist, of what the art and of this time and place is. Otherwise, and this was his phrase, art is just show and monkey business. Somewhere the ideal experience of his work had to exist. So it's very important to follow that vision, and he wrote a sentence that identifies the artist that Judd wanted to have a presence here. In the beginning it was Judd, John Chamberlain, and Dan Flavin, and then he named other artists that he wanted to have a permanent presence here. Robert Irwin was one of those artists. So we continue to follow Judd's wishes. If we're so fortunate that those artists are still with us on this earth. So we continue to engage a very small number of artists that Judd identified to have a permanent presence here. But we embarked on a master plan to just do very facilities-based things, like improving, making sure the buildings aren't leaking, and building more bathrooms, and also bringing back exhibition spaces, because when Judd first established this, it was to support not just the permanent installations by a select group of artists, but also a very vibrant exhibition program. And so there were 3 sizes of exhibition spaces when Judd first established Chinati: a large U-shaped barracks buildings, a kind of medium scale, and then a smaller space. Over time, he actually invited artists to install in those spaces, so we lost the variety of just physical spaces to do temporary exhibitions, but with our master plan, we're reclaiming those. We're renovating or changing the use of other buildings on the grounds. All of that sounds very practical, but I guess I would say the more maybe visionary aspect of what is my responsibility is to make sure that we have a vibrant curatorial program. So from the beginning, we have an artist residence program. An artist is invited to live and work here, and that's how Zoe Leonard's work developed. Or other artists. And so it's important that we continue to keep Chinati open to the artists of this time, of this time and place. And so that's where my work is now, that balance to preserve buildings, artwork, conservation, and present with living artists and ideas that live forward in time.
Well, thank you so much. I guess we have time for a question or two, or a comment maybe from our visitors from the Chinati Foundation. Maybe they want to share a little bit of their experience.
Oh, you were there 10 years ago. You should come back and see the Robert Irwin installation.
Yeah, we're going back in April.
Great, wonderful. Let me know. I'll be sure to say hello to you at the front gate.
I will. Okay.
We have a question over here.
So I'm just interested to know, I think one of the things that everyone I know that's visited Chinati, one of the main things they say is how incredible it is to just have this feeling of being alone in this massive space. And I'm just interested to know the challenges that you as a director face, because obviously you have these like sort of contradictory goals where you have to increase numbers of visitors, but also keep that feeling of isolation and space and solitude, which makes it so special. So how do you sort of tackle those challenges?
So we talk about visitor numbers and visitor experience a lot, but not experience with a capital E, but with a lowercase e. And I think there's a distinction there. I think we've seen the rise of, they even self-identify as museums that are like experiential museums. This isn't that, but this is inherently that, because it's such a phenomenal experience of being there. And we talked a lot as we were going through the master plan, you know, people in the audience, because we did a lot of open forums, hearing from people that were concerned about what a master plan is and what our plans for the future are. And I had so many people say, but I went 10 years ago and I was the only one in this room. If you're saying you have 50,000 visitors a year, and I think many of us have been to the great museums in the world, I'll say MoMA, where I'm standing in a gallery and there are 200 other people trying to look at the same artwork that I am. And that's amazing that art is that popular, and it's problematic because then what is the experience, capital, lowercase e? And so we talk a lot about what number is too many people here. But then I say, could you imagine the first person that's the one person too many that has gotten on an airplane, then flown into El Paso, gotten in a car, driven 3 hours, going 100 miles an hour through the desert, seen 10 other cars, and arrives here, and I say, I'm sorry, you're 60,102, we can't let you in. So I think as long as we're very attentive to it, we can find that balance that anyone who's made this journey has a place here. And we've done that just quite practically by expanding the ways you can experience the museum. When you all came, there were only maybe 2 tours a day, because with 34 buildings and 340 acres, you can't just buy a ticket and wander around on your own. Even if we had the money, there are not enough people in town for us to hire to be guards for all of these spaces. We only do it once a year, and we get 100 university volunteers from colleges across Texas and New Mexico to be all of our guards. And that's the one time of year, October, Chinati weekend, when you can come and wander through all of the spaces on your own. Any other time you have to go on a guided tour. It used to be 2 tours a day. Full collection tour, you had to do the whole thing. Then we did a selections tour, because people who just come and say, okay, I'm not in for a whole day, but I want to see something. So that's Judd, Chamberlain, and Floden, because those were the original artists. But with more and more people coming, we said, well, people should be able to be in some art at any time, whether they show up at 9 in the morning or they show up at 4:45. So now we do open viewing that rotates throughout the course of the day. So anytime anyone comes, they can be in at least 2 of the exhibition spaces. But that's a lot of money for us as an institution. So we've had to be creative in how we do that. So, and I'll be very candid, because I think sometimes people really want to know how museums run. We monetized a private tour experience. Anyone who's coming and wants to pay extra and have the museum on their own schedule with one docent, they can pay a premium for that. And that extra money enables us to institute more open viewing. So we have to be really creative in terms of not sacrificing the experience, but finding the resources, but having a balance so that your experience when you come next year was like their experience 10 years ago.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny. I think I encourage you to talk to Jenny if you see her in the halls. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Jenny, again.
Thank you, Humberto. Thank you.